When I first saw the for sale sign swing in the wind next to my parents' old colonial, it felt like a sign from the universe. I was 30, single, and had finally saved enough from my architectural job in Austin to put a down payment on something real, something mine. The fact that the house was right next door to the place where I'd grown up made it feel like coming full circle. Mom cried when I told her, "You're moving back? Emily, that's... Oh, honey, your father will be so happy." Dad even cracked one of his rare smiles. "Good timing," he said, clapping my shoulder. "It'll be nice having you close." I should have known that sometimes people's words are just masks for what they wish were true. The house itself was small. White shutters, overgrown rose bushes, hardwood floors warped by humidity. But when I unlocked that front door for the first time, it smelled like freedom and fresh paint. I spent the first week cleaning, sanding, sketching remodel plans on the kitchen counter while rain tapped against the windows. Mom stopped by the second evening with a casserole, her way of saying welcome home. She scanned the living room, eyes darting between my unpacked boxes and rolled-up blueprints. "You're going to change things, aren't you?" she asked. I smiled. "Of course. I'm an architect. This place needs life again." She forced a chuckle, but I caught the flicker of unease. My mother loved control more than comfort. Dad followed a few days later to check the plumbing, but I knew he just wanted to make sure I hadn't messed with the view from their kitchen window. "Remember," he said, half joking, "don't go building anything taller than your old man's house." I laughed at the time. I shouldn't have. For the first few weeks, things were fine. We'd have breakfast together on Sundays. Mom would drop off leftovers. Dad would mow my lawn while pretending it was charity. But the moment my renovation work started, the day contractors rolled in with lumber and noise, the tone shifted. Mom's voice came through my phone sharp as glass. "Emily, your workers are everywhere. Do they have to start at 8 a.m.? The dust is getting in our yard." "Mom, it's temporary," I said. The porch needed reinforcement. "Well, maybe you should have thought about that before buying the place." I bit my tongue. The conversation ended with a clipped goodbye. By week 3, she'd started making small comments. "Your house looks modern. Doesn't really fit the neighborhood, does it?" Or, "You've always been so independent. Sometimes too much so." Dad grew distant too. If I waved from the driveway, he pretended not to see. Then came the neighborhood barbecue. They'd hosted it every summer for 20 years. Growing up, I'd loved those nights. The smell of grilled corn, kids chasing each other with sparklers, Dad's old country music playing from the porch. This time, though, when I arrived with a bowl of pasta salad, the laughter dimmed just a notch. "Emily," Mom called, a smile stretched too tight. "You're here. We weren't sure if you'd, be comfortable." "Why wouldn't I be?" I asked, setting the bowl down. Her eyes flickered toward a small group of neighbors, people I'd known since childhood. They glanced away, whispering. I brushed it off and tried to mingle, but whispers followed me like mosquitoes. "Bought the Johnson place, right? Heard she's turning it into some city thing. Must think she's better than everyone else now." When I looked toward my parents, Mom gave a helpless shrug as if to say don't make a scene. I lasted an hour before leaving, my pasta untouched. 2 days later, the real blow came. I came home from work to find my driveway blocked by my father's truck. He stood there with folded arms, jaw tight. Mom hovered behind him, wringing her hands. "What's going on?" I asked, cutting the engine. He nodded toward my backyard fence, newly replaced that morning. "You went right up to the property line," he said. "You're 3 inches over." "It's within code, Dad." I checked. "Don't talk to me about code. You're disrespecting your parents." The words stung more than they should have. It's a fence, not a declaration of war. But he wouldn't move his truck. "You're making this neighborhood look cheap. Either pull it back or we'll call the city." I laughed in disbelief. "You'd report your own daughter?" Mom whispered. "Please don't argue, Emily. You know how your father gets." And just like that, the ground I'd stood on my whole life no longer felt like home. Over the next few weeks, they did more than call the city. They rallied the neighborhood. Noise complaints, parking disputes, even gossip that I was renting rooms to strangers. None of it true. Every day I woke up to another small act of hostility. Trash scattered across my yard, my mail misplaced, Mom accidentally trimming my hedge from her side. I tried to reason with her once more. Mom, what's going on? Why are you doing this? Her face was unreadable. We built this neighborhood's reputation. You're changing it. I wanted to scream. By fixing a house that was falling apart. She looked away. Sometimes change isn't welcome, Emily. That night, I cried harder than I had in years. Not because of the gossip, but because I finally understood I wasn't their daughter anymore. I was a threat to their illusion of control. It escalated faster than I could keep up. A month later, I got a letter, official letterhead, the HOA. Your renovations violate the community aesthetic laws. The complaint? Exterior design inconsistent with surrounding homes. There was only one signature at the bottom of the page. Richard Thompson, chair of HOA. My father. I sat on my front porch staring at it until the sun dipped behind the roofs. The man who'd taught me to ride a bike, to measure twice and cut once, had turned bureaucracy into a weapon. I appealed, of course, submitting photos, permits, even design notes showing compliance. But every meeting ended the same, with polite smiles and dismissals. They'd already decided I was the villain. I started eating dinners alone with the blinds closed, the sound of my parents' laughter from next door slicing through the walls. One night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I whispered to myself, if they want distance, I'll give them something to really look at. It wasn't anger speaking, it was something colder, calmer. The plan began small. I finished the interior renovations quietly, ignoring the outside complaints. I turned my living room into a workspace, applied for a business license, and within 2 months, Thompson Design and Consulting had its name on a shiny brass plaque beside my door. It wasn't just a company, it was my statement. You can't erase me. Within weeks, I was consulting for 3 clients in the neighborhood, people who'd once avoided me but now needed help redesigning kitchens or restoring decks. They whispered their apologies during meetings. We didn't mean to take sides, Emily. Your parents, they can be a little much. I smiled and said nothing. Success was louder than confrontation. Then came the tipping point, the city development meeting. A new park proposal was up for design bids, and my firm, though small, had qualified. The irony? The project bordered my parents' street. Dad, still heading the HOA, attended the meeting in full smug confidence. When my presentation began, I saw his face freeze as my name appeared on the projector screen. Emily Thompson, lead designer, Thompson Design and Consulting. I walked to the front, steady and poised, the click of my heels echoing in the silent hall. Every diagram, every render, every word, meticulous. When I finished, the panel applauded. Afterward, Dad cornered me outside. You think you're clever? Making a spectacle? I looked him straight in the eye. I think I'm doing what you taught me, taking pride in my work. He opened his mouth to retort, but stopped. Maybe he finally realized I wasn't a child to scold anymore. That night, as I turned off the lights in my studio, I caught a glimpse of his silhouette in the window next door, watching. But this time, I didn't look away. I hadn't planned revenge, not at first. But the universe has a way of aligning justice quietly. A month later, the city approved my park design, complete with an access path that would run behind my parents' backyard, opening their exclusive property line to public space. When I read the approval notice, I couldn't help but laugh. I hadn't designed it out of spite, but maybe fate had a sense of humor. Mom came storming over the next morning, waving the city notice. Emily, you did this on purpose. I kept my tone even. It's public development, Mom. The city chose my design. Her face flushed red. You'll ruin our privacy. I smiled softly. I'm just improving the neighborhood's aesthetic. Her jaw dropped at her own words thrown back at her. That was the day I stopped crying. When the first excavator rolled onto the empty plot behind our homes, I heard the engines before I saw them. The sound was deep, steady, powerful, the kind of hum that announces change. The city had approved my design 2 weeks earlier, and contractors were already breaking ground for the public park. I watched from my back porch, coffee in hand, As the dirt lifted, the old fences came down, and sunlight touched corners of land that hadn't seen light in decades. It should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt strangely bittersweet. This was my work, my creation, born right in the shadow of the people who'd tried to erase me. By the third day, my parents' curtains barely moved, but I could feel their eyes on me every time I stepped outside. When I ran into my father at the grocery store that week, the silence between us was sharp enough to cut glass. He was standing in the produce aisle, pretending to examine tomatoes. "Morning," I said, forcing civility. He didn't look up. "You've made quite a stir, Emily. The city council's been calling. The neighborhood association isn't thrilled." I smiled, calm as still water. "That's funny. They approved the plan unanimously." He clenched his jaw, his hand tightening around a tomato until it bruised. "You always have to make everything about you." "No," I said quietly. "I just stopped letting everything be about you." For a moment, the noise of shopping carts and chatter blurred into silence. I turned and walked away, leaving him in the aisle with his unspoken anger. It was the first time I realized that revenge didn't have to be loud to be effective. Sometimes, it was just walking away with your head held high while the other person drowned in their own bitterness. As construction continued, my name started appearing in the local paper, small mentions at first, then longer articles about the young architect behind the city's newest urban green project. A journalist came by one morning to photograph me near the site. I wore a simple white blouse, jeans, and my old work boots. The caption that ran a week later read, "From hometown girl to lead designer, Emily Thompson brings new life to Oakwood." I didn't even have to show my parents the article. I knew they'd seen it the moment Mom stopped waving from her driveway. By late spring, the park began to take shape. The paved walking path wound behind both our homes, lined with young oak trees and solar-powered lamps that glowed softly at night. The smell of fresh soil and wildflowers filled the air. Neighbors who had once avoided me now stopped to chat. "Emily, it's beautiful," Mrs. Lawson said one afternoon as she walked her dog. "Your parents must be so proud." I forced a polite smile. "I think they're adjusting." She laughed. "Well, we're all grateful. You've turned this place into something special." Each compliment landed like a quiet echo of justice. Every thank you was another piece of the wall between me and my parents crumbling, not because I tore it down, but because it couldn't withstand the truth anymore. One evening, I found Mom standing at the edge of her yard, staring at the newly built path. Her arms were crossed, her eyes narrowed. But there was something softer in her face, too, something uncertain. I hesitated, then walked over. "Hey," I said gently. "It's nice, isn't it?" She didn't look at me. "They're saying it'll attract people. Strangers walking behind our house at all hours." "It's a park, Mom. Families, kids, dog walkers." She turned then, her voice trembling between anger and sadness. "You did this knowing it would ruin our privacy." I shook my head. "No. I did this because it's my job. Because I wanted to create something good." She swallowed, her gaze flicking toward the path again. "You always were too ambitious." I smiled faintly. "You used to call that being a dreamer." Her lips parted, but she didn't reply. She turned and walked back inside, the screen door slamming behind her. That sound, metal snapping shut, was more final than any apology could have been. Summer arrived, and with it, the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The city mayor showed up, along with half the neighborhood. Balloons, photographers, children running through the grass. I stood near the podium in a soft navy blue dress, feeling the heat of the afternoon sun on my shoulders. When the mayor handed me the scissors, my hands trembled just slightly. "For revitalizing Oakwood's heart," he said, smiling. As the ribbon split, the crowd cheered. It was surreal. The same people who'd whispered about me months earlier were now clapping, shouting my name. I glanced toward the back of the crowd and saw them, my parents, standing apart, half hidden beneath a tree. Dad's expression was unreadable, Mom's lips pressed thin. But neither of them looked away. I didn't wave. I didn't need to. They were finally seeing what I'd always wanted them to see. Not rebellion, not disobedience, just me. A few weeks later, I got a call from a local TV producer. "Emily Thompson?" a woman's voice said. "We're running a segment on women reshaping small-town architecture. Would you be interested in an interview?" My first instinct was to say no. I didn't want fame. I wanted peace. But then I thought about all those years of silence, of being told to shrink so others could feel bigger. "Yes," I said. "I'd love to." When the interview aired, I didn't expect the reaction it got. The reporter had filmed me walking along the park trail, explaining my design choices, the open path lines, the eco-lighting, the seating arranged for families. But the part that resonated most wasn't the design talk. It was a line I'd said without thinking. "Sometimes the places that break you end up being the ones that make you stronger because you finally learn to build something that's yours." That line went viral on social media. For a week, I was the town's favorite story. The next time I saw my father, he didn't speak. But I noticed the for sale sign quietly vanish from their yard, the one they'd put up out of spite months earlier when the park construction began. They weren't leaving anymore. And that was fine. Let them stay. Let them live next to the reminder that I'd succeeded without their blessing. Still, the silence between us lingered like smoke. I tried to ignore it, but late one evening, as the sun set over the new park, I found myself walking down the trail until I reached the back of their property line. The new oak trees cast long shadows across both yards. I could see Dad sitting on his porch, staring at nothing. For a moment I thought about turning back, but something in me said no. "Hey," I called softly. He looked up, startled. "Oh, it's you." I stepped closer to the fence line, the same one he'd once accused me of building too close. "I thought maybe we could start over." He hesitated, then said quietly, "Your mother thinks you did all this to punish us." I met his eyes. "I did it to prove I could stand on my own. You're the ones who decided that was punishment." He flinched, not from anger, but from truth. "You always were too much like me," he muttered, half to himself. "Maybe that's why we never understood each other," I said softly. He nodded slowly, then stood, hands buried in his pockets. "The park's nice," he admitted. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. I smiled faintly. "Yeah, it is." We stood there in silence, the sound of crickets rising between us, and for the first time in months, it didn't feel like a war zone. It felt like neutral ground. A month later, I hosted an open-air art night in the park, local painters, musicians, food stalls. The turnout was huge. Families spread picnic blankets, kids danced to the guitar music, and lanterns glowed along the paths. When I walked onto the stage to thank everyone, I saw my parents again, this time sitting near the front. Mom's expression was softer, almost proud. After the event, as I was packing up, she approached me. "I didn't realize how much you'd done," she said quietly. "It's beautiful." I turned to her. "You thought I'd ruin the neighborhood." She looked down. "I thought you'd forgotten where you came from, but maybe you just made it better." It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was acknowledgement, and that was worth more. That night, I sat on my porch under the soft hum of the park lights, watching families stroll by, children laughing. The air smelled of grass and grilled food and laughter, everything I'd wanted this place to be. I glanced at my parents' house. Their windows were lit, curtains open. Mom stood at the sink, washing dishes. Dad was reading the paper. Normal. Ordinary. For the first time, I didn't feel excluded. I didn't feel like the outcast. I just felt free. They hadn't changed overnight, and maybe they never would. But they would live every day beside the proof of my independence. The park, the laughter, the life they'd tried to shut out. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real regret. Knowing they had built walls while I had built something that lasted. By the time the leaves began to turn gold along the park's edges, my company had outgrown my living room. What started as one small project had bloomed into something bigger. Clients calling from nearby towns, collaborations with landscape architects, even a request from the city to design an extension for the park's playground. The brass plaque beside my front door, once gleaming with novelty, was now burnished by sun and fingerprints from the neighbors who stopped by just to say hello. Every compliment, every handshake, was another quiet echo of the moment my parents had tried to erase me. I still remember the morning the regional paper called. "Miss Thompson, we're featuring women entrepreneurs redefining community design," the reporter said cheerfully. "We'd love to do a photo spread of you in your workspace." I agreed, though the thought of being in front of a camera made me nervous. When the article came out 2 weeks later, the headline read, "Architect of Renewal: The Woman Rebuilding Her Hometown." It was surreal seeing my name under a story that wasn't about scandal or gossip, but about resilience. The article mentioned the park, the workshops I'd started for young designers, and even quoted one of the city planners saying, "Her work doesn't just change buildings, it changes the people who live in them." That line made me cry. Not because of pride, but because for the first time in my life, someone saw me as a builder of something good, not a destroyer of expectations. That same week, I ran into my mother at the farmer's market. She was standing near the honey stand, sunglasses on, clutching her tote like armor. I could tell she'd seen me before I approached. Her shoulders stiffened the way they used to when she was hiding something. "Hi, Mom," I said softly. She smiled a little too quickly.
Emily.
"You've been busy." I nodded. "It's been a good few months." I saw the article. Her tone was unreadable. "Your father, he didn't say much, but he read it twice." That admission hung between us like fragile glass. "Mom," I said after a moment, "you could have come to the last park event. Everyone kept asking about you." She glanced down at the jars of honey, her fingers tracing the labels. "We didn't want to intrude." Intrude. The word stung, considering how easily they'd once inserted themselves into every corner of my life. I almost told her how I'd cried myself to sleep the night they'd called the city on me, how I'd eaten dinner in silence, listening to their laughter through thin walls. But I didn't. Instead, I took a breath and said, "You're always welcome. You and Dad both." She looked up then, her eyes softening for the first time in months. "You really mean that?" "I do." She nodded slowly. "Maybe next time." When she turned to leave, she slipped a jar of honey into my basket without saying a word. It was such a small gesture, but it felt like something fragile had shifted, like the first thaw after a long winter. By autumn, the park had become the town's favorite gathering spot. Couples walked at sunset, kids raced bicycles down the new path, and local artists started hosting weekend markets under the oaks. I attended quietly, blending into the crowd, just to watch people enjoy what I'd built. It was the purest kind of satisfaction, seeing laughter where there used to be bitterness. But not everyone was laughing. One evening, while I was helping set up lights for a community concert, I overheard two older neighbors talking by the fence. "It's a shame about the Thompsons," one said. "Used to be the heart of the block. Now, no one even waves." "Pride," the other replied. "It's a lonely thing." Their words cut deeper than I expected. My parents had always craved admiration like oxygen, bake sales, church committees, HOA meetings. Now, that attention had turned into polite avoidance. They had exiled themselves from their own kingdom. The next week, I saw it firsthand. The city hosted a Community Excellence Awards night, small certificates, local press, that sort of thing. My company had been nominated for Neighborhood Impact of the Year. I didn't plan on going, but the event coordinator called personally. "We'd love to have you, Emily. You've changed the town." So I went. It was held in the same community center where, a year ago, my father had sat across from me and dismissed my renovation plans. Now, my name was printed on the program under honoree. When they announced the award, I walked up to the stage, lights bright, applause echoing. The mayor shook my hand and whispered, "Your father's in the crowd." Proud moment, isn't it? I turned slightly, and there he was standing near the back wall. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes followed me the entire time. When I stepped down, the applause fading, I caught his gaze and nodded once. He didn't smile, but he didn't look away either. That silent acknowledgement felt heavier than any trophy. The next morning, he came to my door. It was the first time he'd set foot on my porch since the day he'd accused me of ruining the neighborhood. He stood there in his faded work jacket, the same one he'd worn when I was a child helping him fix broken steps. His hair had more gray in it now, and he looked smaller somehow, like pride had worn him down.
"Morning," he said.
"Morning, Dad. I figured I should congratulate you." He handed me a small box, clumsy and wrapped in newspaper. Inside was a miniature level tool, the kind used for carpentry, polished and engraved with my initials. "You used to borrow mine all the time," he said, voice gruff. "Figured you should have your own." For a moment, I couldn't speak. "Thank you," I managed finally. "This means a lot." He nodded once, staring past me at the park behind my house. "You did good, Em. Better than I thought you would." There it was, his version of an apology. I smiled softly. I learned from the best. He almost smiled back. "Your mother's baking tonight. Stop by if you want." "I will." And for the first time in what felt like forever, he turned and walked away without slamming a door behind him. That evening, I stood outside their house holding a dish of lemon bars I'd baked that afternoon. My heart pounded as I knocked. Mom opened the door, surprised but smiling. "You came." The house smelled like cinnamon and old memories. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one I'd eaten at as a teenager, the same one where I'd announced I'd bought the house next door. For a while, conversations stayed safe. Weather, work, neighborhood gossip. Then, as the silence stretched, Mom sighed. "You know, when you bought that house, I thought you were doing it to keep an eye on us. Like you didn't trust us to live our own lives." I blinked, startled.
"What?"
"I just wanted to be close." "I know that now." She looked down, twisting her napkin. "But your father and we'd always imagined you'd go somewhere big. New York, Chicago, anywhere but here. When you moved back, it felt like we'd somehow failed." Her honesty hit like a cold wind. "Failed?" I whispered. "You didn't fail. You built this place, Mom. You gave me roots." She met my eyes, tears brimming. "And you turned those roots into wings." For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then she reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm sorry, Emily. We were wrong." I squeezed her fingers gently. "You were scared. I get it." She smiled through her tears. "Your father's still learning how to say sorry, but that's why he gave you the tool." I laughed softly.
"Yeah."
"He's not subtle." We both laughed then, the kind of laughter that breaks tension and rebuilds trust. Later that night, as I walked home along the park path, the lamps glowed softly against the trees. Crickets sang, and the wind carried the faint sound of my parents' laughter through the open window. For the first time, it didn't sting, it comforted me. I realized that the revenge I thought I wanted, the validation, the power, the success, had never really been about them. It was about proving to myself that I could survive their rejection and still build something beautiful, that I didn't need their permission to belong here. The next morning, I hung the small level tool above my drafting table, right next to my city permit framed on the wall. Two symbols side by side, one for my past, one for my future. And every time I started a new design, I'd glance at it and remind myself, balance isn't about making everything even. It's about knowing what to keep steady and what to let go. Winter arrived early that year, frosting the park's oak leaves and rooftops in silver. Each morning, when I stepped onto my porch, the air smelled of wood smoke and pine. The town seemed quieter somehow, peaceful, like it had finally learned how to breathe again. Business was steady, better than I ever expected. The park's success had opened doors. Suddenly, people from nearby cities were calling, asking if I'd consult on their community spaces. A regional design firm in Dallas even invited me to collaborate on a project, a cultural center that would blend architecture with local history. I said yes, without hesitation. It felt surreal. A year ago, I was the pariah next door. Now, my email inbox was full of congratulations. One morning, I got a letter from the city council. "You've been nominated for the State Emerging Architect Award." I read it twice, sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold. My name, printed in bold black letters, looked foreign somehow. The first person I wanted to tell was Mom. Then I remembered how she'd once told me I was too ambitious. Funny how time softens even the sharpest words. That weekend, I decided to visit. It had been months since I'd sat inside their house. Not just on the porch. Not just a brief hello. A real visit. When I knocked, Mom answered wearing her old apron, the one with faded sunflowers on it. "Emily," she said, surprised but smiling. "You're just in time. I made soup." The kitchen smelled exactly as it had when I was a kid, garlic, thyme, and something warm simmering on the stove. Dad sat at the table, reading the paper. "Hey there, kiddo," he said, his voice softer than I remembered. We ate together, talking about ordinary things, the weather, the neighborhood, even the dog that kept running into their yard. But beneath the small talk, I noticed something different. The living room lights flickered slightly. The wallpaper near the vent was peeling. And on the counter sat a stack of unopened bills half hidden beneath a dish towel. I didn't mention it. Not then. When I left, Mom hugged me longer than usual. "Don't be a stranger," she said quietly. I promised I wouldn't. A few weeks later, while meeting with a client at City Hall, I overheard a familiar voice in the hallway, my father's. "Property taxes went up again," he was saying. "We're managing, but it's getting tight." The man he spoke to, a city accountant, nodded sympathetically. "You could apply for senior adjustment, but it takes months." My heart sank. My parents had never talked about money, but I knew their pride wouldn't allow them to ask for help. That night, I sat on my couch staring at my phone, debating whether to call. The part of me that still carried resentment whispered, "Let them handle it. They pushed you away. They can deal with consequences." But another voice, quieter yet stronger, said, "They're still your parents." By morning, my decision was made. I went to the city clerk's office under the guise of researching new property zoning. While there, I asked discreetly about residential relief programs for elderly homeowners. The clerk handed me a few pamphlets, explaining the process. Then, I did something that would have shocked anyone who knew how stubborn I used to be. I filled out the forms myself. Under Contact for Assistance, I wrote my own name but left my address blank. I wanted them to receive help without knowing where it came from. When the approval letter arrived 3 weeks later, I watched from my window as my mother stood in her yard, reading it. Even from a distance, I saw her shoulders relax. She called my father outside, her voice breaking with relief. He looked up briefly, toward my house, scanning as if he sensed something. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second before he looked away. It was enough. Life settled into a rhythm after that. My Dallas collaboration took off, and I found myself traveling between cities, splitting time between work and home. The more I grew, the less I needed to prove. My revenge, if you could even call it that, had transformed into something quieter. It wasn't about making them regret their choices anymore. It was about showing them, by example, what grace looked like. Still, sometimes I'd catch myself standing by the window late at night, watching the lights in their house flicker through the trees. The resentment had dulled into something more complicated: love, pity, gratitude, and a lingering ache for the years we'd wasted on pride. In February, I received the invitation to the State Architectural Gala. The event would be held at a grand hall downtown, and the nominees would be honored in front of hundreds of industry professionals. When I arrived, the room was dazzling: chandeliers, polished marble, the hum of conversation mixing with soft jazz. I wore a simple black dress, my hair pinned loosely. When my name was announced as one of the finalists, applause filled the air. I didn't win that night, but as I stood on stage accepting the recognition plaque, I realized it didn't matter. I wasn't chasing validation anymore. The girl who once cried on her porch after being humiliated by her own parents had learned something they never could teach her. Peace doesn't come from being right. It comes from being whole. After the ceremony, I stepped outside into the cool night air. My phone buzzed, an unknown number. I answered hesitantly. "Emily." It was my father. "Hey, Dad. I saw the article in the paper about your award. Your mother's been showing it to everyone." I laughed softly. "She's proud, huh?" "She should be. We both are." For once, there was no defensiveness in his tone, no unspoken judgment. Just truth. "Thanks," I said. "That means a lot." He paused. Listened about the tax stuff. My heart skipped. What about it? We got a notice that someone filed on our behalf. The city said there was no name, but, well, I know your handwriting. I froze, half smiling. Guess I didn't cover my tracks well enough. He exhaled, the sound thick with emotion. You didn't have to do that. After everything. I know, I said softly, but I wanted to. There was a long silence, then a faint chuckle. You really are too good for us sometimes. Not too good, I replied. Just done keeping score. He cleared his throat. Dinner tomorrow?
Yeah.
I'd like that. Dinner the next evening felt different. No tension, no pretense, just quiet comfort. Mom had made roast chicken, and Dad poured me a glass of wine without saying a word about the good bottle. We talked about my projects, about their plans to plant new rose bushes by the fence come spring. At one point, Mom reached across the table and said softly, We've spent so long trying to make you fit our version of you. I think maybe we were scared you'd outgrow us. I smiled gently. You didn't lose me, Mom. You just had to meet me again. She blinked back tears. I like this version. So do I. After dinner, we stood on the back porch together, watching the park lights shimmer through the frost. The path I designed glowed like a silver thread connecting us, bridging what pride had once broken. Dad leaned on the railing beside me. You know, he said, I used to look at that house of yours and feel like you'd built a wall between us. And now? I asked. He smiled faintly. Now I think you built a bridge. I looked toward the park, children's laughter faint in the distance. I guess that's what I do, I said softly. Build things that last. He nodded slowly, eyes glistening. Yeah. You do. Later that night, after I walked home, I stood by my drafting table and stared at the small level tool he'd given me. It gleamed in the lamplight, perfectly balanced. I realized that revenge had never really been the point. Regret wasn't something you could force on someone, it was something they had to feel when they saw what they'd almost destroyed. And my parents felt it every time they looked out their window. At the park, at the home next door, at the daughter who refused to disappear. That was enough. By the time spring rolled back into Oakwood, the air smelled of fresh grass and possibility. The park was alive again, children's laughter bouncing off the slide rails, the scent of grilled food drifting across open lawns, the same oaks I'd planted now taller, stronger. Every time I walked the path, I could feel the rhythm of my own heartbeat in the pulse of the town. It wasn't just a project anymore. It was proof that beauty could grow from broken roots. My career had taken on a life of its own. The Dallas collaboration turned into 2 more projects, one for a Riverwalk redesign, another for a historic library restoration. Emails poured in from cities I'd only seen on maps. Every message began the same way. We saw what you did in Oakwood. And yet I still lived in that same little white house next to my parents. I could have moved to the city, bought something sleek and modern, surrounded myself with steel and glass, but I didn't. Because every morning when sunlight streamed across both our yards, I remembered the sound of my mother's voice calling my name as a kid, and I realized the street wasn't just where everything went wrong. It was also where everything started to heal. One Saturday, I was out watering the lemon tree that stood near my porch, something I'd planted the year the park opened, when Mom appeared at the fence line. She was holding a tray of seedlings and a hesitant smile. Thought these would look nice by your walkway, she said. Marigolds? I asked, setting down the hose. They were your grandmother's favorite. We planted them together, kneeling side by side in the soil. For a long time, we worked in silence, the kind that no longer hurt. When we finished, she brushed her hands against her jeans and said softly, You know, people used to tell me how proud I must be, having a daughter like you. And I'd smile, but deep down I felt embarrassed that you didn't need us anymore. I looked at her, startled by the honesty in her voice. She met my eyes. Now I understand that's the best thing a parent can hope for, to raise someone who can stand without you. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of earth and blooming citrus. I reached over and squeezed her hand. You didn't lose me, Mom. You just gave me enough strength to build my own foundation. She smiled then, small and genuine. You always did know how to put things into blueprints. That evening, I got a call from a producer with a national architecture show. Emily Thompson? We'd love to feature your work in our upcoming documentary on sustainable design. Would you be willing to be interviewed? I laughed, partly in disbelief. You're serious? Completely. We want to show how small-town innovation can inspire the world. It was flattering, terrifying, and humbling all at once. I agreed, though I could already imagine my father's face when the camera trucks rolled up our street. Filming day came 2 weeks later. Crew members bustled around the park with cameras and mics, capturing shots of the trails, the playground, and the reflection of sunlight on the pond. The host, a kind man in his 40s, asked to film a short segment at my parents' fence. Symbolism, he said, for roots and reconciliation. When we started recording, Dad walked out onto his porch, arms folded. Need an extra set of hands? He called. I smiled. Always. He joined me beside the fence while the cameras rolled. The host asked, Emily, what inspired you to build here, to return home instead of moving on? I paused, glancing at my father. Because sometimes, I said slowly, the hardest place to grow is the ground that hurt you first. But when you do, you make it fertile again for everyone. Dad cleared his throat, pretending to study the sky, but I saw his eyes glisten. The camera crew caught it all, though no one said a word. When the episode aired a month later, it spread fast, shared online, replayed on local news. My inbox overflowed with messages from strangers, single mothers, young architects, even retired builders who said the story reminded them of why they'd fallen in love with creating in the first place. But the message that meant the most came hand-delivered. A small envelope slid under my front door one evening. Inside was a note, written in my father's steady, slanted handwriting. Your mother and I watched the show. I never realized how much strength it takes to forgive people like us. I'm sorry we made you feel small for wanting something big. The park looks better every day. We sit there sometimes. Love, Dad. I read it twice, tears blurring the ink. I didn't frame the letter or keep it in a drawer. I pinned it right above my drafting table, eye level, where I could see it every time I worked. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at the state university where I'd once studied. The lecture hall felt enormous, the air buzzing with anticipation. Standing at that podium, facing rows of bright-eyed students, I felt something I hadn't in years, belonging. I used to think revenge meant proving someone wrong, I told them. Now I know it means proving yourself right, by living well, by building things that last. Afterward, a young woman came up to me, clutching her notebook. My parents think design is a waste of time, she said, voice trembling. They want me to study business. I smiled. Then build something so good they can't ignore it. She grinned through tears. That's exactly what I needed to hear. Walking out of that hall, I realized I'd become the person I'd once needed when I was her age. The voice that said you're allowed to dream even when no one claps for you yet. Back in Oakwood, the seasons turned again. The marigolds we'd planted by my walkway were now a bright, fiery border of gold. My parents and I had fallen into a comfortable rhythm. Dinners once a week, quiet talks on the porch, laughter that no longer sounded forced. One Sunday afternoon, Dad appeared at my door with a rolled-up set of blueprints under his arm. I've been sketching something, he said sheepishly. Thought maybe you could look it over. I unfolded the paper on my dining table. It was a simple design, an outdoor reading nook for the park, complete with benches and a small pergola. His lines were rough, uneven, but the idea was solid. This is good, I said, smiling. Really good. He looked genuinely surprised. You think so? I know so. We ended up working on it together over the next few weeks, him bringing old tools from a shed, me refining the layout. It was the first time we'd built something side by side since I was a kid. When the structure was finished, the town gathered to see it unveiled. A brass plaque gleamed in the sunlight. The Thompson Nook, designed by Richard and Emily Thompson, for everyone who needs a quiet place to dream. Dad stood beside me as the crowd clapped. Guess we're partners now, he whispered. I laughed. Best project I've ever done. That night, as the lanterns in the park flickered to life, I sat on my porch watching the silhouettes of families reading under the new pergola. My parents sat together on their bench, hands intertwined, the same way they used to when I was small. I thought about how far we'd all come, from betrayal and bitterness to something that looked a lot like grace. And I realized something simple but profound. Regret had never been my goal. But if my parents did feel it, I hoped it wasn't the kind that punished. It was the kind that healed, that taught, that softened pride into understanding. Because that's what this story had always been about. Not revenge, not triumph, just transformation. The kind you build one plank, one apology, one quiet act of love at a time. Later that week, a letter from the city arrived, officially naming the entire greenway Thompson Park. When I showed it to my parents, Dad just stared at the paper, silent. Then he whispered, "I don't deserve that." I placed my hand on his. "Then earn it, by being part of it." He nodded, eyes wet. "Deal." As dusk settled that evening, I walked the park's path one last time before heading home. The lamps glowed like gentle constellations, the air smelled of lemon and marigold, and for the first time since the day I moved back, everything felt balanced. I paused halfway down the path and looked at the two houses standing side by side, once divided by fences and pride, now connected by light. Home wasn't about who stayed or who left. It was about who finally learned to open the door again. And under that soft, forgiving sky, I knew we all had. When the town council unveiled the sign for Thompson Park that spring, the applause rolled like distant thunder across the grass. My parents stood beside me, smiling, and for the first time in years, there was no tension beneath the surface, no hidden war between pride and resentment. Just peace. The crowd dispersed slowly after the ceremony, families heading to the playground, couples strolling beneath the oaks I'd once planted with shaky hands and stubborn hope. I lingered, my fingers brushing over the new plaque that bore our name. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" Dad said beside me. "Seeing our name out here for everyone to read." "Yeah," I said softly, "but in a good way." He nodded. "You know, when I was younger, I thought legacy meant property and titles. Something you own. But this," he gestured toward the open field, the trees, the laughter. "This is different. This is something you leave behind." I smiled. "That's exactly what it's supposed to be." He chuckled, glancing sideways. "Guess you taught me a few things after all." Over the next few months, the park became more than a place. It became a classroom, a stage, a meeting ground for people who wanted to create. On weekends, I started hosting small design workshops for local teens who dreamed of studying architecture but didn't know where to start. We'd gather near the Thompson Nook, sketchbooks in hand, the smell of cut grass filling the air. I taught them how to see lines not just as measurements, but as possibilities. How every wall could tell a story. One afternoon, as the students packed up, I noticed one girl lingering behind, a quiet, dark-haired 16-year-old named Lila. She was shy, always sketching on the edges of her notebook. "Can I see?" I asked gently. She hesitated, then turned the page toward me. The drawing was breathtaking, an entire park pavilion, curved like a seashell, made of reclaimed wood and glass. "This is incredible," I said, genuinely impressed. "Where did you learn perspective like that?" She shrugged. "Nowhere. I just see it in my head." "Have you ever thought about studying design?" She shook her head. "My parents think it's a waste of time. They want me to go into accounting." Her words echoed my own story, like a ghost from the past. I smiled softly. "Then do both. Count your dreams, too." She laughed, the sound nervous but bright. Before she left, I gave her one of my old sketching pencils, the same one I'd used when I first drafted the Oakwood Park design. "Keep it," I said, "for when you start your first project." Her eyes widened. "Really? Really?" As she walked away, sunlight caught her hair, and I realized that sometimes the best revenge against a world that tries to limit you is to make sure no one else has to fight the same battle. That summer, my company received an invitation from the State Department of Community Renewal, a formal proposal to lead a statewide design program aimed at reviving neglected towns. The letter called my work a model of empathy-driven architecture. I sat at my kitchen table, letter trembling in my hands, and for a long moment, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I thought about the girl I'd been, standing in the shadow of my parents' house, trying to prove I belonged. I thought about every door that had slammed in my face, every meeting where I'd been talked over, every dinner where I'd been told I was too ambitious. And now the state wanted me to teach others how to build what I'd once been told I couldn't. The irony was poetic. That night, I walked next door and knocked. Dad opened the door, raising an eyebrow. "You know it's still unlocked most days, right?" "Old habits," I said, smiling. "Got something to tell you." When I showed them the letter, Mom's hand flew to her mouth. "Emily, this is... Oh, honey, this is incredible." Dad read it slowly, nodding. "Looks like the state finally figured out what we knew all along." I chuckled. "You didn't always think that." He grinned sheepishly. "Yeah, well, I'm old enough to admit when I'm wrong." I hugged them both, and in that embrace, I felt something shift again. Not forgiveness this time, but partnership. The next few months blurred into motion, meetings, travel, presentations, but Oakwood always stayed home base. My parents started volunteering at the park, organizing weekend cleanups, planting flowers by the pond. One afternoon, I found Dad hammering a new sign into the ground near the pergola we'd built. "Need help?" I asked. He handed me a nail. "Might as well make this official." The sign read, "Community Volunteers of Thompson Park led by Richard and Margaret Thompson." I laughed. "You named it after yourselves?" He winked. "You inspired it. We just run it." For the first time, the two of us stood there not as adversaries, not even as a father and daughter trying to mend something broken, but as equals. Builders. That fall, I was invited to give a keynote at a national design conference in Denver. The theme, Redefining Home. Standing on that stage, lights bright and faces blurred in the distance, I felt the same nervous excitement I'd felt presenting at my first city meeting years ago. But this time, I wasn't proving myself. I was sharing what I'd learned. "Home," I said, pausing to let the room still, "isn't the place that never changes. It's the place that lets you. Home is the conversation between who you were and who you've become. It's not built from walls, it's built from forgiveness." The crowd erupted into applause, but I barely heard it. All I could think about was that little white house on Maple Lane and the parents who'd finally learned to see me not as a threat, but as a reflection of their best selves. When I returned to Oakwood, I found a letter waiting on my doorstep. The handwriting was delicate, unfamiliar. Inside was a simple note. "Ms. Thompson, I got accepted into the state architecture program. I used your letter of recommendation. Thank you for believing in me when no one else did. Lila." I pressed the letter to my chest, tears welling in my eyes. The next day, I framed it and hung it right beside my father's note. Two lives changed by the same lesson, that belief, once given, multiplies. Months passed, and the town flourished. The once quiet streets were now lined with flower beds and murals painted by local students. Thompson Park had become the heart of Oakwood, a place where generations overlapped, where arguments turned into conversations, where laughter carried farther than gossip ever could. One evening, I hosted a small community dinner at the pergola. My parents came early to help set up. Mom arranged candles, Dad strung fairy lights through the beams. The air buzzed with the smell of baked bread and citrus. As the crowd gathered, I looked around, the same neighbors who'd once judged me, now shaking my hand, thanking me, telling me how proud they were. I caught my parents watching me, their smiles easy and unguarded. When I stood to speak, I didn't prepare notes. I just let my heart lead. "I used to think this place was too small for me," I said. "But maybe I just hadn't grown into it yet. You don't have to leave home to find yourself. Sometimes you just have to rebuild it." There was a moment of quiet, then applause that rolled like a wave through the night air. Later, after the crowd dispersed, I sat by the pond with my parents. Fireflies blinked in the darkness, their reflections dancing on the water. Mom leaned against Dad's shoulder. You've changed this town, Emily. I smiled. No, we did. Together. He chuckled. Guess we made something worth keeping after all. We sat in silence for a while, the kind that comes only after storms have passed, the kind that doesn't need words to explain itself. Above us, the stars shimmered, tiny reminders that even the smallest lights can change the night. And I thought, maybe that's all legacy really is, the quiet glow you leave behind when you finally make peace with where you started. By the time the next spring came, Thompson Park no longer felt new. The grass had grown thick, the oak trees had stretched wider, and laughter had worn gentle grooves into the walking paths. What once stood as a symbol of defiance now breathed like a living thing, steady, familiar, whole. Every morning, I'd make coffee and sit on my porch, watching the sunlight spill across the park. Sometimes, I'd see my father sweeping leaves near the pergola or my mother chatting with children planting flowers. It amazed me how seamlessly they'd woven themselves into the community they once tried to control. There was a kind of poetry in it, the way we had all learned to change together. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the National Architects Guild. It was embossed, heavy, official. Dear Miss Thompson, we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected to receive the National Civic Design Award for Outstanding Contribution to Community-Based Architecture. I stared at it for a long minute, unable to move. My breath caught somewhere between disbelief and laughter. National recognition. The girl once dismissed by her own parents had somehow reached the highest circle in her field. When I walked next door to show them, Dad answered in his gardening gloves. What's that grin for? I handed him the letter. He read it once, twice, then looked up with a half-smile that trembled at the edges. Guess they finally figured out what I've known for a while, he said. Mom peeked over his shoulder, her eyes shining. They're honoring you in Washington? Next month, I said. I want you both there. Dad opened his mouth to protest, something about travel, about crowds, but Mom elbowed him gently. We'll be there, she said. Wouldn't miss it for the world. The ceremony was surreal. A ballroom full of chandeliers and velvet drapes, hundreds of strangers applauding as my name echoed through the speakers. I wore a simple emerald dress, no glitter, no pretense. When I walked onto the stage to accept the award, I looked out into the sea of faces and found them, my parents, sitting near the front. Mom clasped her hands together, tears glimmering in her eyes. Dad was upright and proud, the kind of proud that didn't need words. As I took the microphone, a hush fell over the room. I wasn't always sure I belonged here. I began. I used to think home was just a place. But I've learned it's the people who challenge you, break you, and, if you're lucky, stand beside you again when you rebuild. I glanced at them. This award isn't just mine. It's for anyone who ever had to start over right next door to where it all fell apart. The crowd stood, applauding. My parents stood too. And for that single shimmering moment, everything, the hurt, the pride, the years, felt folded into something complete. We returned to Oakwood that weekend to a small celebration at the park. Neighbors hung lights from tree branches, kids carried paper lanterns, and someone brought a chocolate cake shaped like a tiny house. As night fell, Dad clinked his glass. Speech, he shouted, grinning. I rolled my eyes, laughing. You already heard my speech. Different crowd, he said. Smaller, but louder. Everyone laughed. I looked around at the faces, friends, students, families, and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the string lights overhead. I used to think regret was something you gave to the people who hurt you, I said. But maybe it's something you take away from yourself instead. The moment you stop needing them to see your worth, you finally see it yourself. A quiet settled over the group, the kind that means people are listening with their hearts. Then applause rose again, soft at first, then strong. As the party thinned out, my parents and I sat together on a bench near the pond. The moon shimmered on the water, and fireflies drifted between us like floating embers. Mom leaned her head on Dad's shoulder. You think she'll ever slow down? Not a chance, he said, smiling. She's got my stubborn streak. I laughed. Pretty sure that's where I get it. He turned to me, eyes soft. You know, I used to think we were teaching you lessons. Turns out, you were teaching us. Mom reached for my hand. We made mistakes. Big ones. But thank you for giving us the chance to make it right. I squeezed her fingers. We all learned. That's what matters. The three of us sat in comfortable silence, the park lights casting a soft halo around us. The night smelled of lemon blossoms and soil, the scent of work, growth, and peace. Over the following months, life settled into something beautifully ordinary. My company expanded its mentorship program statewide. Lila, the shy student I'd once given my pencil to, was accepted to architecture school on a full scholarship. She sent postcards from every city she visited, each one signed. Still building. Still learning. At home, my parents became unofficial guardians of the park. Every morning, they watered the marigolds, trimmed hedges, and chatted with visitors. Sometimes they'd walk to my house afterward, bringing muffins or stories. It was quiet happiness, the kind that sneaks up on you after years of chaos. One Sunday morning, I woke early and walked the park's loop alone. The dew sparkled on every blade of grass, the town still half asleep. I stopped beneath the pergola Dad and I had built together and ran my fingers along the engraved plaque. For everyone who needs a quiet place to dream. I thought about the girl I'd been when I first moved back, angry, desperate, heartbroken. And I thought about the woman I'd become, steady, fulfilled, forgiving. The space between those two versions of me wasn't measured in years or achievements. It was measured in grace. As I stood there, an older woman approached, her granddaughter skipping beside her. "Excuse me," she said shyly. "Are you the one who designed all this?" I nodded. She smiled. "Thank you. My husband passed away last year. This is the only place that makes me feel close to him." Her words caught in my throat. "That means more than you know." She touched my arm. "You built more than a park. You built a place for people to start over." After she left, I sat on the nearest bench and let the tears fall, not out of sadness, but gratitude. Maybe that was my real reward. Not the award in my office, not the headlines, not the recognition. It was this, a stranger finding comfort in something I'd created. That evening, I invited my parents over for dinner. We sat around my table eating roasted vegetables and lemon pie, laughing about old memories, the disastrous camping trip, my first driving lesson, Dad's infamous barbecue fire. At one point, Mom looked around the room and said, "You know, I used to think the best years of our lives were behind us. But sitting here, I think they're right now." Dad nodded. Agreed. I raised my glass. "To the new version of us." "To the new version," Mom echoed, clinking glasses. Later, after they'd gone home, I stepped out onto my porch. The night air was cool and clear, the park bathed in moonlight. Fireflies hovered above the marigolds we'd planted together. I thought about everything that had happened, the betrayal, the isolation, the anger, the triumph, and realized none of it had been wasted. Every crack in the foundation had made room for light to seep in. People talk about revenge like it's fire, but real revenge, I'd learned, is more like water. It reshapes quietly. It heals what it touches. It outlasts everything. A few weeks later, I received one final invitation from the city council asking if I'd serve as Oakwood's community design advisor. I accepted, of course, but on my own terms. The first project I proposed wasn't about architecture at all. It was about people. I suggested a scholarship fund for young designers who couldn't afford college, named after my parents. When I told them, Mom started crying immediately. "Emily, you didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," I said. "You both taught me what roots really mean." Dad just nodded, too choked up to speak. The following spring, during the fund's first ceremony, a small crowd gathered by the pergola. Lila stood at the podium, reading from a note, her voice trembling with emotion. "To build something lasting," she said, "is to forgive where you began. Because forgiveness is the foundation of everything that stands." She looked at me, smiling. "Emily taught me that." The applause rose, and somewhere in the back row, my parents stood with tears in their eyes, holding each other's hands. That night, after everyone left, I walked through the empty park one last time. The lamps glowed softly. The air hummed with the memory of voices and laughter. I stopped at the edge of the path, where the two houses stood side by side, their windows golden in the distance. Once, that view had made me feel small. Now, it filled me with peace. This was where I'd been broken, rebuilt, and reborn. And as the wind rustled through the marigolds and the lemon trees swayed gently beside my porch, I whispered into the quiet, "Thank you for everything." Because even pain, when faced with grace, becomes part of the architecture of who you are. And the home I'd built, not just the house, not just the park, but the love surrounding it, would stand long after we were gone.